Good evening, Wabash. My name is Derek Nelson, professor of religion here at Wabash. I mistakenly thought that someone much more important than I would welcome you, but it's me. So here I am. But my main task is actually to introduce our speaker tonight, whose presence we're so blessed and about to be enriched by. It's my great honor to introduce a fine Wabash man, Dr. Richard Gunderman. Rick is a committed physician, polymath, professor, parent, and pupil. A brief word about each of those P titles. Rick probably holds the world's record for smallest font on his business card, as his title is Chancellor's Professor of Radiology, Pediatrics, Medical Education, Philosophy, Liberal Arts, Philanthropy, and Medical Humanities and Health Studies at Indiana University School of Medicine. He regularly sees patients and maintains his clinical interests and commitments, does physician Gunderman. A polymath is one with many different kinds of knowledge, one who can see connections between those varied domains. Rick's publications indicate this. He wrote, "We make a life by what we give," a wonderful introduction to the theory and practice of philanthropy. He has forayed into biography, penning lives of Nikola Tesla and Marie Curie. A collection of inspirational life profiles is the book We Come to Life by Those We Serve, in which we learn about legendary basketball coach John Wooden's ice cream eating habits and why Victor Frankenstein was not a very happy guy. Professor Gunderman is an award-winning teacher. He was Bicentennial professor at IU in 2019 to 2021 and has won the IU Trustees Teaching Award not once, not twice, but 10 times. He teaches every student in the MD program at IU. No matter how badly they might want to avoid Professor Gunderman, he told my class this morning, they cannot. Parent Rick is the husband of Laura and the father of Rebecca, John, Peter, and David. Peter and David both graduated from Wabash College in 2012 and 2015 and earned a variety of advanced degrees too. The degrees earned by father and sons include 2 PhDs, 2 MDs, an MDiv, an MPH, a few MAs, and an OGRD, which I don't know what that is. Evidently, if you take all the letters of those degrees, you can spell the word Voldemort. Son David told me that Rick once had the idea to do a mini lecture series on historical figures. Academics do this sometimes with other scholars as a way of sparking research, but these lectures were for a different context. They were for each member of the family to give a short but formal presentation at the dinner table. David was in mid-chew of his pork chop when he heard the story of Vincent van Gogh losing an ear. An adolescent at the time, David told me that he was mortified at having to do his lecture the next week, but he now admires a parenting style that sees teaching and learning as joyful things. As a pupil and lifelong learner, Rick Gunderman inspires. He told our class this morning about a weeks-long series of meetings with a patient's parents where he simply wrote down notes about these people's amazing experience in caregiving. These otherwise unheralded folks had adopted 15 children with profound special needs and fostered many others, in addition to raising their 6 biological children. Rick wanted to know how they did it, so the doctor made himself the student and listened. Raymond Williams told me that Eric Dean, Rick's mentor at Wabash, agreed to design a special major in the Humanities for Rick when he was a student because he had quickly demonstrated an aptitude and deep love for learning in all kinds of disciplines and above all, in the deep questions. The theologian John Calvin thought that the beginning of wisdom was docilitas, or teachability. Though he is a teacher, and even a teacher of teachers, Rick Gunderman remains a teachable man, and in that way, a model for us all. His presentation is called You Contain Multitudes. Join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Gunderman.
Good evening. It's a delight to be here. I hope you'll find this intriguing, perhaps even engaging, and at least a few cases inspiring. And I want to start with kind of a gee whiz tour of an important part of reality. Some of you may recognize this verse from the book of Psalms, Psalm 139. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Wow. What a lesson to take from an education at Wabash College, or for that matter, from a life well lived. We are more remarkable, we are greater wonders than we commonly suppose. For example, you contain an unimaginable number of atoms. In those atoms, the electrons rotate at about 4 quadrillion revolutions per second, the nucleus of those atoms rotating at about 5 billion trillion revolutions per second. We cannot understand the most basic substances of which we're made. At the atomic level, it's also a blooming, buzzing confusion. There are no liquids or solids or gases, no colors. If you're an average-sized adult human being, contain about 4 times 10 to the 27th hydrogen atoms. That is an incredible number, I think, beyond our capacity to comprehend. At the molecular level, you contain about 10 to the 27th molecules. Every day of your life, you make and use up the equivalent of your body weight in ATP. What's ATP? Adenosine triphosphate, right, or the energy currency of the cell, and more than 99% of the molecules of which we are made are water. Water itself is more remarkable than we commonly suppose. Transparent, tasteless, odorless. It contains no energy, but it's vital for life. It's a weird molecule that gets less dense when it converts from liquid to solid. It's often called the universal solvent. I'm sure this is apocryphal. My son David, who's in attendance, lived in Berkeley, California. The Old Wives' Tale says that the Berkeley City Council was presented with a resolution to ban the presence of dihydrogen oxide within the city limits because it's such a powerful solvent. Of course, we all know that's the chemical formula for water. It has unbelievable surface tension. It can be transported from the roots hundreds of feet into the air into a giant sequoia or redwood. And it's extraordinarily incompressible. We are not only surrounded by wonders, but we contain wonders. If you're an average-sized adult human being, you have about 50 trillion cells in your body. By comparison, you have about 100,000 hairs on your head. At least the younger men in attendance do. About a third of those cells are erythrocytes, which in a sense don't live because they don't have nuclei. So you might say they can't carry out the functions of life and they're not alive, but anyway, they live for about 4 months. And because you have about 17 trillion red blood cells that live on average 120 days, that means in the time it takes me to say live 120 days, you just put about 2 million new red blood cells into your circulation. And I would also point out that 90% of the atoms of which you're made, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, so forth, turn over every year. So we're 90% atomically renewed, something brand new every year. As I said, at the cellular level, about 50 trillion cells. Each of those cells contains about 100 trillion atoms. That's you contain more atoms in your body than cosmologists believe there are stars in the universe. You are, in a sense, a universe unto yourself. And I'll also point out that each of those 50 trillion cells carries out about 1 billion chemical reactions every second. You are indeed wonderfully and fearfully made. And by the way, that's not just you, that's the stuff of which you're made. Some of you may know the human can be called Adam. Adam, of course, comes from a Hebrew word that means earth. And in every teaspoon of earth outside this building, there are thought to be about 10,000 bacterial species, about 1 billion bacteria, miles of fungal filaments. And by the way, that's not just life outside the body. You're carrying around right now about 5 pounds that consists of 100 trillion microbes in your intestine. We are wonderfully and fearfully made. At the social level, it's quite likely, statistically speaking, that the number of atoms in you, today were in another person a year ago. About 100 billion of the atoms in your body were in every other living human being's body a year ago. And if you went back 3,000 years in human history, essentially everybody you met would be an ancestor of yours. This has cultural implications as well. Who created English? What's the point of that question? The most spoken language on earth, about 1.5 billion native speakers. It's the most commonly learned second language. Do we owe it to Shakespeare, the authors of the King James Bible, Chaucer, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, who came to England a long time ago? The point is, we don't know who created English. The point is, English wasn't created. The point is, English is in the process of creation, and we are all co-creators. The point of this is to say that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, not only individually, but corporately. The purpose of this talk tonight is to ask you to consider what our lives would look like if we took that lesson to heart, if we really believed in the marrow of our bones that we contain multitudes. In fact, we interpenetrate in the multitudes we contain. The boundaries between us aren't quite as distinct as we commonly suppose. So I invoke the greatest poet in American history, Walt Whitman, who said, "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents born here, from parents born the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death." Until we know what the human is, our prospects for leading the best human lives are constrained. The more deeply we appreciate the reality of what it means to be human, which is biological as well as cultural, poetic as well as biological, the better we understand that, I think the better our prospects are to lead the kind of lives for which our educations are richly preparing us. So the rest of this talk is about Walt Whitman, who thought about those atoms, those molecules, those clods of earth, those leaves of grass, those cells and tissues and organ systems and whole organisms, and the symbiotic relationships between human organisms, parents and children, families, neighborhoods, communities, states, nations, humanity writ large. Whitman understood this with a richness and depth rarely equaled on American soil. Ezra Pound, what was it, 1906 to 7? I bet I'm off by a year or so. But anyway, former instructor in Romance languages and literature on this faculty, said Walt Whitman is America's poet. In fact, Walt Whitman is America. If you want to know what it means to be an American, what you as an American are called to do, and more importantly to be, you can hardly find a better source both of information and inspiration than Walt Whitman. By the way, a man who had about 2 years of formal schooling, like perhaps the greatest person ever to come from our state, namely Abraham Lincoln. 2 years of formal schooling. You're going to get at least twice that many here at Wabash College. I congratulate you and look forward to finding out what you can do with it. Walt Whitman was born in Long Island in 1819, died in Camden, New Jersey in 1892, the year my other alma mater, the University of Chicago, was founded. He left school at the age of 11, and in 1855 he published, actually self-published, Leaves of Grass, his best-known work. In 1862, during the Civil War, Walt's brother George was reported as injured in a newspaper account. Whitman left home and went to find his brother. He found George not badly injured, superficial facial wound, he's going to be fine. But what he saw on his search for his brother changed his life. This is the person who wrote the greatest work of poetry in the history of the United States of America. He encounters sick and wounded soldiers and embarks on a path that involves writing but does not involve the composition of poetry. I think Walt Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass hoping he could bind the fracturing nation of the United States together. Everybody saw civil war looming. Whitman realized his words couldn't prevent the war, but he could do something during the war to make a difference. So he agreed to transport a group of soldiers from Virginia to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and worked there pretty regularly for over 3 years as a volunteer at the bedside of sick and wounded soldiers. Why did the greatest poet in American history choose to volunteer at the bedside of sick and wounded Civil War soldiers? By the way, both Union and Confederate. Presumably, he could have been writing the greatest poetry the nation, perhaps some of the greatest poetry humanity had ever known, but he elected to go work as a nurse, or as he himself would put it, as a wound dresser with no formal medical training or qualification. According to Whitman, he makes 600 visits to the bedsides of sick and wounded Civil War soldiers. He estimates he visited between 80,000 and 100,000 patients. He had, as I say, no formal preparation in medicine or nursing, but I think Whitman believed that at the bedside he would see things, hear things, do things, learn things, and contribute things that he simply couldn't do anywhere else. By the way, people in the health professions choose to spend a good bit of our time at the bedside. Is that a horrible place no human being should ever need to inhabit? Or is it in fact a place where something profound about the human might be revealed to us? Well, I want to focus on 4 characteristics of Walt Whitman that I think brought him to the bedside. And you can see what those are: courage, charity, compassion, and communion. What shocked Whitman into volunteering as a wound dresser? The answer is he saw a pile of amputated feet, legs, and arms, cut bloody, black and blue, swelled and sickening. I can't emphasize enough, this is not a place most of us would choose to spend any time at all. In fact, as soon as we realized where we'd stumbled into, we'd turn around and leave. It was not attractive to the eye. The sounds pierced the ear. It was heart-wrenching. It smelled terrible. The putrefaction of human flesh is a very noisome experience. But Whitman was there. He assisted with the amputation of many soldiers' legs. In one case, he said, the soldier was so traumatized, he chose to spend the night in a cot by the bedside to support the young man. It's important that we hear the words of Walt Whitman. During those 3 years in hospital, camp, or field, I made over 600 visits or tours, and went, as I estimate, counting all, among from 80,000 to 100,000 of the wounded and sick, as sustainer of spirit and body in some degree in time of need. These visits varied from an hour or two to all day or night, for with dear or critical cases, I generally watched all night. This is somebody who's not being paid to be there. It's not in his job description. He doesn't even have a job in the hospital, but this is where he chooses to spend his time. Sometimes I took up my quarters in the hospital and slept or watched there several nights in succession. Why did he do that? Well, it's important to recognize he was not focusing on human flesh in the usual sense. He was not preoccupied by the gore, but by the human beings who were suffering and in need of care. Walt Whitman believed that in such extremities, what makes us human can be revealed especially clearly. And Walt Whitman's mission, as he saw it, was to understand the American and the human. We can never be better as Americans than we are as human beings. Walt Whitman aimed to understand the human. So he spent his days in a terrible place nobody else would choose, but he did it because he thought he could make a difference. I think that must be one of the most profound of all human longings, the desire to make a difference in the lives of another person or perhaps multiple people. Whitman found his way to do that. And by the way, not only wasn't he paid to do it, but he did so at considerable personal sacrifice. This is an artist's depiction of Whitman's one-room, what we would call apartment. Not very well kept, but really a poor man's dwelling, a humble hovel, so to speak. Whitman himself was an army paymaster's clerk, like Albert Einstein, third-grade Swiss patent clerk. He figured out he could do his work in a few hours, and then he would go to the hospital to volunteer. Of course, Einstein didn't volunteer in hospitals, but in his Annus Mirabilis, 1905, published 5 papers, each one of which deserved the Nobel Prize in physics. You might say, oh, Einstein, what an incredible human being, the person of the century. Walt Whitman, over at the bedside of the sick and wounded. No comparison. One of my messages this evening is that those are 2 equally meaningful and impressive human contributions. So Whitman not only gave what little he had, he went around and solicited donations. That may not sound like much, but it's a lot if you can enlist other people in giving. Give them a chance to enjoy the human excellence of generosity. The most influential human being who ever lived, who was that? There's some students who know the answer to that question. The global health crew, yes. Aristotle, that's right, the most influential human being who ever lived, at least according to the people at MIT. And who are we to gainsay the Massachusetts Institute of Technology? Anyway, Aristotle said you basically can't lead a full human life unless you are practicing generosity, unless you are giving and delighting in the difference your giving, your sharing, your contributions make. And by the way, they may not be contributions of treasure. They may be contributions of time or talent or testimony. But according to Aristotle, we cannot lead a full human life unless we somehow bring the human capacity for generosity to life. So anyway, a lot of these soldiers Whitman cared for didn't have a cent. And in comes Walt Whitman with his haversack, kind of his backpack packed with things for the wounded and sick soldiers. Whitman's account: I try to give a word or a trifle to everyone without exception, making regular rounds among them all. I give all kinds of sustenance, Blackberries, peaches, lemons and sugar, wines, all kinds of preserves, pickles, brandy, milk, shirts, and all articles of underclothing, tobacco, tea, and handkerchiefs. And now for the clincher, I always give paper, envelopes, and stamps. Why would the greatest wielder of the English language in American history always give paper, envelopes, and stamps? So Whitman obviously received no remuneration for his efforts, but he did go out of his way to share whatever he could get his hands on. He'd work for a few hours to keep a roof overhead and food on the table, and then labor many more at the bedsides of the sick and wounded. I think Walt Whitman felt that the opportunity that provided him to care was sufficient reward in itself. You might think, I want money, I want power, I want fame. Walt Whitman wanted to care. He wanted not to gain for himself, but to give or share the best he had with others. And I think there's a real message in that, which Derek mentioned. We may make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. Walt Whitman knew that not only up here, but in here. And he showed the rest of us Americans what that might look like in practice. So Whitman showed a lot of compassion. Many of his patients languished. They did not do well. You know, we didn't yet know about bacteria and their role in wound infections or dysentery. We were decades from antibiotics. So the doctors were somewhat limited in what we could do. We were all focused on the medical issues. Walt Whitman could linger, right? I'm going from bed to bed as fast as I can, ticking off boxes on my to-do list, making sure I've seen every patient. Walt Whitman could sit down at that bedside, eye level with the patient, and talk with them. He could listen to their stories. He could read to them. In some cases, he held their hands. May not sound like much, but suppose your presence is one of the greatest resources available to you. And suppose you could treat that presence as a gift. Some of you know, in the book of Job, Job loses his property, his family, his health. His three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to visit him. What do? What do Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar do when they come upon the greatest man in all the East, their friend, now reduced to a pitiable figure, covered in ashes, scratching his sores with potsherds? What do? They sit down next to him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights. What's the lesson there? It's that our presence, our being there, is sometimes the greatest resource at our disposal. So, and it's important to remember these soldiers. You might picture people in their 30s or 40s. Most of these soldiers were boys, 16 or 17 years old, who were away from home for the first time in their entire lives. These are lost boys who need somebody to make them feel human again. Here's a story from Whitman. Anybody recognize the artist who created this still life? Anyway, it's Van Gogh's painting of his family Bible. He asked me to read him a chapter in the New Testament. I complied and asked him what I should read. He said, make your own choice. I opened at the close of one of the first books of the evangelists and read the chapters describing the latter hours of Christ and the scenes at the crucifixion. The poor, wasted young man asked me to read the following chapter also, how Christ rose again. He talked of death and said he did not fear it. I said, why, Oscar? Don't you think you will get well? He said, I may, but it is not probable. I have either the terrible misfortune or the immense blessing to sometimes be with young children, sometimes preschoolers, certainly school-age children who have terminal diseases. There are a few more heartbreaking things I can think of, but I must tell you, sometimes the courage, the understanding, the patience, these young human beings who will never graduate from grade school, let alone get to attend a day of college, it is truly moving. Often they're not in the role of comforted, they are actually in the role of comforter, comforting their parents, their siblings, their grandparents. It's quite extraordinary what we human beings are capable of doing under very unexpected circumstances. This is a letter Whitman wrote to a deceased soldier's wife. I do not know his past life, but I feel as though it must have been good. At any rate, what I saw of him here under the most trying circumstances, with a painful wound and among strangers, I can say that he behaved so brave, so composed, and so sweet and affectionate, it could not be surpassed. Imagine what these words meant to that newly widowed young woman who would never see her husband again, or a mother who would never see her son again. And now, like many other noble and good men, after serving his country as a soldier, he has yielded up his young life at the very outset in her service. We talk about the ultimate sacrifice. Whitman witnessed that on many occasions. I want to say Whitman didn't know medicine. He didn't have an LPN or an RSN or a BSN or an MSN or a DNP, not doctorate in nursing practice. He didn't have an MD or a PhD or an MSW or registration in any number of technological fields. But Walt Whitman brought to the bedside that no one else could was a deep, deep understanding of the human. He couldn't do a lot with a prescription pad or a scalpel or an endoscope, but he had experienced human life in a way that had opened his eyes and his ears and his heart to things that all of us should be more attuned to. So with each soldier, he found a unique life story. You might say we're biological creatures. I said a lot about that at the beginning. I would submit to you now that even more profoundly, more impressively, we are not biological creatures, but biographical creatures. We have a story. In fact, we're composing our story every day. Whitman was absolutely fascinated by the stories of human beings. He savored them. He cherished them. He kept them close to his heart, and he did his best to share them with other people. So what did Walt Whitman do? Well, he connected the soldiers inside the hospital, but he also connected the soldiers with the outside world, their mothers, their wives, in some cases their daughters. He wrote letter after letter. The greatest American ever to put pen to paper, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln, at least in terms of what it means to be an American, he chose to spend his time basically taking dictation from wounded and sick soldiers to create letters that could be sent to the folks back home. And in those letters, he sometimes transcribed what they said. But on other occasions, he transcribed what they would have said. And I think above all, Walt Whitman understood and conveyed what needed to be said. He made an enduring difference in the lives of human beings he would never meet, namely the folks back home for whom he somehow harbored a deep compassion, despite the fact that he would never meet them. Here's one such letter. January 21, 1865, my dear wife, you must excuse me for not having written to you before. I have not been very well and did not feel much like writing, but I feel considerably better now. My complaint is an affection of the lungs. I am mustered out of service, but am not at present well enough to come home. I hope you will try to write back as soon as you receive this and let me know how you all are, how things are going. Let me know how it is with Mother. I write this by means of a friend who is now sitting by my side, and I hope it will be God's will that we shall yet meet again. Well, I send you all my love and must now close. Your affectionate husband, Nelson Jabo. Written by Walt Whitman, a friend. You know, there are people in hospital, people in chronic care facilities, total nursing, assisted living facilities right here in Crawfordsville, Indiana, who might have somebody in their lives that they need to be connected to. Every one of us who's literate at least has the theoretical opportunity to be of service to people in such a condition. Whitman wrote, "Many sick and wounded soldiers have not written home to parents, brothers, sisters, and even wives for one reason or another for a long, long time. Some are poor writers. Some can't get paper and envelopes. Many have an aversion to writing because they dread to worry the folks at home. The facts about them are so sad to tell. I always encourage the men to write and promptly write for them." Why was the greatest poet in American history writing letters home from sick and wounded Civil War soldiers? Surely he had more important matters to attend to add to the canon of American poetry. Or could it be that Walt Whitman did in fact add to the canon of American poetry? Could it be that these homely little letters amount to a great deal more than many of us would commonly suppose? Who might you this evening write a letter to? One of the folks back home. What might you say in your letter? Would that be a complete waste of time in the internet age to write a letter to somebody in your own hand? I mean, I think Whitman's testimony raises this enduring question for all of us. What has become of writing? What has become of communication? What has become of communion? And Whitman was caring not only for the soldiers, but for families, desperate for news. He could imagine these people in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Georgia. He could imagine these people who he would never meet and write the letters they needed to receive. I'd like to read this poem by Walt Whitman, but instead I'll invite you to do that on your own time. But it's a lesser-known work by Whitman known as Come Up From the Fields, Father. It's about a mother who gets an unexpected and unwanted letter. By day her meals untouched, then at night fitfully sleeping, often waking, in the midnight waking, weeping, longing with one deep longing. Oh, that she might withdraw unnoticed, silent from life escape and withdraw, to follow, to seek, to be with her dear dead son. Those words are in the vocabulary, the everyday vocabulary of everybody in this room. But look what Whitman was able to do with them. Not simply because of great verbal fluency, but because he had immersed himself in what it means to be human. Walt Whitman, who had 2 years of formal schooling, managed to provide himself and the rest of us with an unparalleled liberal education. He taught us what it means liberal, right? Liberty, libere, to free. Freedom. Walt Whitman understood what it means to be free, what a price we should be willing to pay for our freedom, and the powerful resource our language represents in preserving and promoting freedom and helping one another become the best human beings we're capable of being. So you do contain multitudes. That is a scientifically unassailable fact. Multitudes beyond our wildest imagination. And these multitudes don't distinguish us from one another. In many respects, they bind us together. We are in intercourse with one another all day, every day, in the exchange of atoms, for example, not only with one another, but from the earth from which we were drawn, right? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. You contain multitudes. What do you do with that knowledge? From Walt Whitman's point of view, the most appropriate thing to do is to live with courage, to be willing to go places others are reluctant to go to. It doesn't have to be some far-flung corner of the earth. It might be an assisted living facility. It might be the home of a homebound, disabled resident of Crawfordsville, Indiana. To go there not only with courage, but with charity, aspiring to make a difference in another person's life, to care for someone for whom no one else, at the least at that time, seems to be moved to care. And to meet that person not with disdain, but with compassion. To recognize that there, but for the grace of God, goes every one of us. And finally, to go there in search, above all, of communion. For once we know what we most deeply share, then our humanity enjoys its best chance to fully express itself. Not only our individual humanity, but our shared corporate humanity. So remember Walt Whitman, and remember something Whitman never wrote, but I think deeply intended, namely the simple three-word phrase, you contain multitudes. I'm going to stop there. I think we now have an opportunity to, take questions, objections. I know for a fact there are people in this auditorium right now who know more about Walt Whitman than I do. So I probably got a few things wrong. I just can't tell which ones they are. So I'll be relying on the English majors to set us all straight. Any comments or questions? Because I would have enjoyed droning on for a bit longer, but I was told to save some time for comments and questions. So now it's going to be heartbreak for me that I cut my droning short for something that turns out not to happen. Great opportunity to exhibit a certain kind of compassion, a certain kind of charity, to come to the aid of a distressed speaker, to answer the call of a fellow Wabash alumnus, and help out, please. Who I can't see. Gino. Guitar in hand. That's a great question. I guess we actually have a PhD mathematician here in the front row. Any insights on multitude, David? I guess there's single and multiple more than one. But, I think we rarely pause to ponder the true, to coin a term, multitudinousness of our condition. I recognize that's not a word, but the multitudes that we are part of are far more extensive and deeper than we commonly suppose. And if we just understood that science, if we understood, say, the carbon cycle, if we all had the benefit of understanding the carbon cycle as it's taught, in ecology, it might create opportunities for us to feel more connected to one another and open up opportunities for us to collaborate and to care for one another. Who knows? Could the natural sciences help to tease out some of what's best in us in terms of ethics and politics? I suspect the answer might be yes. Please, I can hardly see you, so.
How did Mr. Whitman get in the position to start off on this journey? How old was he when he started? In his 20s or what?
Well, when was he born? 1819. He started on this in 1863. Anybody good with math? No. In his 40s.
So how do you get into this concept and proceed down? Was that his life's work?
His work at the bedside? I don't think it was his life's work. I'll tell you this, though. This, to me, is important. Walt Whitman believed those long hours in Civil War hospitals ruined his health. That at the end of that, he was not the vigorous human being he had been when he undertook it. And I think he, like any of us, regretted that, but I think he also savored the opportunity it presented him to sacrifice. Sacrifice doesn't mean, to give up to destruction. Sacrifice means something more like to make sacred. To make sacred. That he could make his days, or his days could be made sacred by spending them in the company of these distressed boys. And maybe that's what we long for. We were talking at dinner tonight. Nick Eberstadt says 1/6 of American males in their 30s and 40s are AWOL, away without leave, not seeking employment, not involved in the economy. What's that about? What happened to these young men? It could be that they didn't receive adequate job training or something. I suspect in many cases they have a deep longing to make a difference, and they see no clear path before them to do so. If you can help the rest of us see a way to make a difference in the lives of other people, to make some meaningful and enduring contribution, you have shared with us one of the very best gifts any human being can give to another. Money is good, power is good, fame is good, but the opportunity to make a difference is far better still. And I think Walt Whitman found that opportunity at the bedside. There was another, yes, sir.
What has given you courage in your life and your career? What was the question?
What has given you, thank you, Jim, I'm sorry. What has given you courage in your life and career? I had a Wabash College education. My grandfather was lying in a bed at Community Hospital East at roughly 21st Street and Ritter on the east side of Indianapolis. He had suffered a rather severe stroke that affected his language centers in such a way that he could produce nonsensical speech but could not produce comprehensible speech. He'd also developed an incarcerated inguinal hernia, which could have been surgically corrected. The decision had been made not to have that hernia surgically corrected. My father, my brother, and I were standing at the bedside of my grandfather. I must have been, I don't know how old I was, 25 years old, recent Wabash College graduate. This may not sound like much to you, but it's something I'll never forget. We'd come to the end of our visit, and my father wasn't sure what to say. We were mindful this was the last time we might see my grandfather, my father's father. And I don't know where this came from, but I said, "I love you, Grandpa." Is that courage? I don't know. Some pretty simple words. But I'd never told my grandfather that before. And at that moment, at that bedside, those words came out of my mouth. And I'll be eternally grateful for that. And I believe my Wabash education made it possible to say that. Not exclusively, but they played an important role. That the books I'd read, the conversations I'd had, the essays I'd written, the speeches I'd given, had prepared me to say some of the most difficult words I would ever utter, and it turned out in the uttering they were absolutely one of the most natural things I've ever done. Difficulty, impossibly overestimated. Fulfillment in uttering them beyond my comprehension. And I hope your Wabash education does that for you. Maybe you want to get into a law school or medical school or a graduate program. Who knows what you might want to do, but it could also prepare you to say a few very simple words, the same very simple vocabulary that Walt Whitman mastered, but in saying those words, you might make a difference in the life of someone that turns out to make a profound difference in your own life. Yes, sir.
So, ever since we arrived on campus when we were freshmen, we've been told that one of the core tenets being a Wabash man is to live humanely. Do you think that as Wabash men and as a future Wabash graduate, your call to action to be courageous, have charity, compassion, and have community starters?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, an emphatic yes. That the virtues, we might say the human excellences that Walt Whitman brought to life are the very same excellences to which we aspire, and they have to do with being human, with being more fully human, more deeply human. And to me, that's what it means to live humanely. Walt Whitman showed us what it might mean as Americans and as human beings to live as humanly as we possibly can. And in that, he extended us a great gift that it would be a shame to squander. You know, what a shame it would be not to receive that gift with open hands and grateful heart. I think a lot of us think, Walt Whitman, I can go to poetry.com, I can download Whitman's entire corpus for nothing. If it's available for free over the internet, obviously because the copyrights have expired, if it's available for free, it can't be worth very much, can it? That which is free, that must be worthless, right? But hopefully by virtue of your Wabash education, that you understand that things that are free are sometimes far from worthless, but in fact utterly priceless and the very most precious resources we have available. They can't be purchased at any price. I mean, you can buy, the Norton Anthology of Whitman's poetry or something, but to read it with care, to discuss it with others, to let it loosen the bounds of your imagination and follow it where it leads, that takes real effort. And if you could do that with Whitman's poetry, you can do it with other human beings too. Yes, sir.
Something striking about modern perspective of Walt Whitman is that he went and gave it to books better than to soldiers.
Thank you for saying that. I meant to say that and didn't.
Well, you mentioned it, and I just wanted to ask, do you have any words of advice on loving the people that we may despise or believe in?
Boy, is that ever a great question. I think some great people in the 20th century, Simone Weil, French, I don't know what she was, theologian, mystic, I'm not sure. Dame Iris Murdoch, Oxford Don, they opened our eyes to a possibility that ethics isn't so much deciding between right and wrong as ethics is attending to what most warrants our attention. And if we can see that gray coat as a human being, cut from exactly the same cloth, made from exactly the same alloy, in fact, made of some of the very same building blocks we were made of a year ago, I think the need to follow an ethical imperative to some degree takes second place to the recognition that this is, some people might want to say, this is my brother, son of God, daughter of God, brother or sister. Doesn't matter whether their uniform is blue or gray or anything else. Can we enjoy the rivalry? Can we inspire one another to perform at our best in the Monon Bell game without hating the students, staff, and faculty from DePaul University? I believe the answer to that is yes. We can in fact draw out what's best in each of us and recognize that we're brothers and sisters, offspring of the same God, let's say. And I think Whitman felt that very deeply, that brotherhood or sisterhood, what have you. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that Whitman carried out this act of service because it would also provide some value to his own life? And do you think, or where do you think the value should be drawn between doing an act of service for self-gain or self-worth, doing it for others?
Well, let me address that in terms of Whitman's biography. I think Walt Whitman believed when he published Leaves of Grass in 1855 that he was providing a myth. And by the way, by myth, I don't mean something untrue. From my point of view, myth would be the profoundest of truths. That he was providing a myth that could hold the nation together. He saw what was coming. He wrote Leaves of Grass in an effort to keep the country he loved together in the face of an impending schism. The Civil War brought on Walt Whitman's so-called silent period. He didn't write any poetry. And I believe that's because Walt Whitman was deeply wounded by the Civil War, and he sought some means to enable his wounds to heal. And oddly enough, he found that place among the wounded. Not so much the psychically wounded, but the physically wounded. But by tending to the wounds of others, he could somehow help to heal his own wounds. I don't think he did it with his own needs foremost in mind, but I think a sort of byproduct of his effort to be of service was that it helped to bind up some of the deep wounds in Walt Whitman's own heart. Had he been using those soldiers for his own benefit, none of this would make any sense. But I'm utterly convinced, and I think Whitman provides as powerful testimony as we could ask for, that he was there for the benefit of the soldiers. And there was this wonderful byproduct that Walt Whitman himself, in a way, got better through that act of service, that act of sacrifice, you might say. Well, I've enjoyed this a lot. I hope it's been of some interest to you. If it inspires even one person to return to the poetry of Walt Whitman, our time together will not have been wasted. And I just want to say the matters we've discussed this evening are of deep personal interest to me. And I'm not just saying this. If you're ever of a mind to carry these conversations further, I would be not only a willing but an eager conversation partner, because I think, frankly, we don't have much more important to talk about. And when we spend it on these matters, we're expressing this human capacity for communication and communion just about as well as we possibly can. So I hope some of you will join me at some point in pursuing these lines of thought further. And thanks again very much to Wabash College, the administration, the faculty, the students. It's just been a delight to spend the day with you, and I'm looking forward to get to spending some more time tomorrow with a few faculty and students. So thank you very much.